The conference room had gone silent in the most terrifying way possible. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes right before a collapse. 100 eyes were fixed on the giant screen, where numbers blood red across the charts like fresh wounds. Stock lines were falling by the second. Contracts worth billions were hanging by a thread. At the center of it all stood Adrian Vale, one of the youngest billionaires in the world, a man who had built an empire from steel shipping and technology, now watching it slip through his fingers because no one in the room could understand the words that mattered most. A delegation from overseas sat across the polished table, speaking rapidly in their native language, their faces growing colder with every passing moment. The interpreter Adrian had trusted with the most important deal of his life had collapsed with a medical emergency just minutes before the meeting. No backup had arrived. No one else could bridge the gap. A single misunderstanding in a clause hidden deep inside the contract had already cost him nearly $2 billion in market value. And if the deal failed completely, the losses would multiply into ruin by morning. Then, from the far corner of the room, where no one had thought to look, a quiet woman in a plain gray maid's uniform stepped forward, and everything changed. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that greatness can come from the most unexpected places, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps stories like this reach more hearts around the world. Adrian Vale had spent his entire life learning how to win. At 38, he was the kind of man magazines called unstoppable. His sharp jawline, tailored suits, and calm, unreadable eyes had become symbols of modern success. Financial channels followed his every move. Business schools studied his decisions. Competitors feared him. But what the world did not see was the exhaustion that lived behind his composed expression. For the past 3 months, Vale Global Holdings had been fighting the biggest crisis in its history. A revolutionary shipping corridor project, one that promised to connect 3 continents and transform international trade, had become entangled in legal disputes, language barriers, and political tensions. Adrian had invested nearly everything into it. Not just money, but his reputation, his future, and the last promise he had made to his late father. His father, Leonard Vale, had been a humble dock worker before building the company from a single warehouse by the harbor. On his deathbed, he had held Adrian's hand and told him that wealth meant nothing if it could not build bridges between people. Adrian had turned those words into ambition, but somewhere along the way, the bridges had become numbers, contracts, and acquisitions. Now, on the eve of the final signing, the project was collapsing. The foreign investors from East Asia had discovered inconsistencies in the legal translation of the contract. The chief interpreter, a highly paid expert, had suffered a sudden stroke in the lobby before the meeting. Panic had spread through the executive floor. Adrian's senior staff scrambled desperately, calling agencies and embassies, but no qualified replacement could reach the building in time. The investors began to stand, their expressions hardening with disappointment. That was when the maid stepped forward. Her name was Alina. Most people in the building barely noticed her. She arrived before sunrise, cleaned the marble floors, polished the glass walls, emptied the trash bins, and disappeared long before the executives finished their first coffee. She wore her dark hair tied neatly into a simple bun, her face marked by quiet resilience rather than beauty in the conventional sense. There was something steady in her eyes, something that suggested storms survived rather than comfort known. She spoke softly, yet every person in the room heard her. She said she could help. At first, no one moved. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. One even let out a dry laugh, the kind that carried disbelief and arrogance in equal measure. Adrian turned toward her, his frustration sharpening his features. He was a man seconds away from financial disaster, and the last thing he expected was an interruption from the housekeeping staff. But then Elena looked directly at the foreign delegates and spoke. The room froze. Her pronunciation was flawless. Her tone carried not only fluency, but the cultural precision of someone who understood more than words. She did not simply translate sentences. She conveyed meaning, emotion, legal nuance, and respect. The delegates, who had been moments from leaving, slowly sat back down. For the next hour, Elena became the lifeline of an empire. She moved through the contract clause by clause, identifying errors that the original interpreter had overlooked. A critical mistranslation had transformed a profit-sharing agreement into what appeared to be an ownership transfer. Another clause involving liability protections had been interpreted in a way that insulted the investor's legal standards. Adrian stood in stunned silence as the woman who had been cleaning his office every morning saved a deal worth $11 billion. By the end of the meeting, the red numbers on the screen began to stabilize. The investors extended their hands. The contract was signed. Vale Global had been pulled back from the edge. But Adrian could not stop thinking about one question. Who was she? That evening, long after the boardroom had emptied, Adrian found Elena quietly wiping fingerprints from the glass walls outside his office, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. For the first time in years, he looked past the uniform. There was a tired grace in the way she moved, the kind carried by people who have learned to make themselves invisible in order to survive. He asked her where she had learned the language. The answer hit him harder than the day's financial losses ever could. Elena had once been a professional interpreter for international courts and diplomatic negotiations. Years ago, she had worked among ministers, lawyers, and world leaders. She had been respected, admired, and sought after. Then life had broken her. Her husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her alone with a young son. Medical bills for her child's chronic heart condition had consumed everything she owned. When immigration complications and unpaid debts forced her out of her former career, she took whatever work she could find. Cleaning offices at night had become the only way to keep her son alive. Adrian listened in silence. For the first time, the billionaire who had spent his life mastering numbers was faced with a truth no spreadsheet could contain. The woman who had just saved billions was barely surviving on minimum wage. That night, Adrian could not sleep. He sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly below him, but his mind remained in the quiet hallway outside his office. He kept seeing Elena's hands, roughened by cleaning chemicals, holding a contract that controlled the future of nations. The contrast haunted him. The next morning, he made an unusual request. He asked Elena to join the executive team temporarily as a consultant for the remainder of the project. The board erupted in protest. They called it reckless. They called it unprofessional. Some quietly called it absurd. But Adrian overruled them all. What began as a temporary assignment soon became something far greater. Elena's insights transformed negotiations that had stalled for months. She understood not only language but people. She could sense hesitation before it surfaced, pride before it hardened into refusal, fear before it turned into conflict. Deals began closing. Partnerships once thought impossible started forming. Within 6 weeks, Vale Global recovered every dollar it had lost. Within 3 months, profits had doubled. But the greatest transformation was not happening in the company. It was happening in Adrian. For years, he had measured people by titles, resumes, and appearances. Now he found himself humbled by the woman who entered every room without demanding attention and yet changed everything inside it. He learned about her son, Noah, a 10-year-old boy with bright eyes and a fragile heart who spent more time in hospitals than playgrounds. Elena never complained, never asked for sympathy, and never used her story as leverage. She simply worked harder than anyone Adrian had ever known. One rainy evening, Adrian visited the hospital where Noah was being treated. The room was small, filled with machines that hummed softly in the dim light. Elena sat beside the bed, holding her son's hand while reviewing translated documents on a tablet balanced in her lap. Noah smiled weakly at Adrian and told him his mother was the bravest person in the world. Something inside Adrian cracked. All his wealth, all his achievements, all the headlines celebrating his brilliance suddenly felt hollow compared to the quiet courage of a mother refusing to let despair win. The next morning, Adrian personally arranged for Noah to be transferred to one of the best cardiac specialists in the country. Every expense was covered. Elena cried for the first time since he had known her. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just silent tears of exhausted gratitude slipping down a face that had spent years pretending to be stronger than pain. Weeks later, disaster struck again. A rival corporation leaked false information suggesting fraud in Vale Global's international contracts. Markets panicked. Investors threatened lawsuits. News channels exploded with speculation. The company's shares began another brutal descent. This time, however, the crisis was not financial alone. The leaked documents had been manipulated to frame Elena as the source of internal corruption. The same executives who had once mocked her now demanded her immediate dismissal. Adrian faced the hardest decision of his career: protect the company's image by sacrificing the woman who had saved it, or risk everything by standing beside her. He chose her. Against the advice of lawyers, board members, and shareholders, Adrian held a live press conference. He stood before cameras from around the world and spoke not as a billionaire, but as a man who had finally learned what true worth looked like. He said that character could not be measured by wealth, titles, or uniforms. He said that the company owed its survival to a woman the world had ignored. He publicly defended Elena, sharing the truth of her role in saving the billion-dollar deal. Then came the twist no one expected. Elena herself discovered the fraud. While reviewing archived multilingual documents, she noticed subtle phrasing patterns identical to those used by a former legal advisor who had recently joined the rival company. Her knowledge of linguistic signatures exposed the real culprit. The rival firm's scheme collapsed within days. Vale Global's stock rebounded stronger than ever. Adrian became a hero in the media, but he knew the truth. The real hero had been standing in the background all along. Months passed. Noah's surgery was successful. For the first time in years, Elena smiled without sadness hiding behind it. And Adrian, the man once consumed by wealth, began to rebuild his company culture from the ground up. He raised wages for all support staff, introduced education sponsorship programs, and created an internal policy ensuring that every employee, regardless of role, had a voice in innovation and problem solving. He named the initiative the Bridge Program in honor of his father's final words. One winter evening, Adrian invited the entire company to the grand opening of the new international headquarters. The building was breathtaking, all glass and steel and light, but at its entrance stood something even more powerful: a bronze plaque. It did not bear Adrian's name. It bore Elena's. It read, "Never underestimate the quiet strength of those the world refuses to see." Before the ending, a special request: comment below with one word that describes how this story made you feel. Your words may inspire someone else who needs hope today. The final scene came a year later. Adrian stood at the opening ceremony of the Global Shipping Corridor project, now one of the most successful infrastructure ventures in modern history. Leaders from multiple nations gathered beneath a sunrise painted in gold and crimson. Beside him stood Elena, no longer in a maid's uniform, but as Director of International Communications, respected by presidents and CEOs alike. Yet what moved Adrian most was not the applause, the cameras, or the billions earned. It was Noah running across the platform with laughter in his voice, his small heart finally strong enough to keep pace with his dreams. Adrian watched mother and son embrace, and in that moment, he understood something wealth had never taught him. Sometimes the person who saves your empire is not the one sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes it is the one silently cleaning the room after everyone else has left. And sometimes the greatest fortunes are not measured in billions, but in the lives we choose to lift. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps keep stories of hope kindness, and second chances alive for others who need them most. Because in the end, the billionaire did not just save his company, he finally saved the part of himself that had forgotten how to see people. And the maid who once walked unseen through polished hallways became the bridge that changed countless lives forever.